Let us think about wild animals. Do they need servants or silver plates to eat from? Hardly. They rely entirely on themselves and they still manage to survive just fine. So we must ask ourselves, is a philosopher, someone who considers themselves a citizen of the entire world, going to place their confidence in other people wherever they happen to live or travel? Are they going to depend on others rather than relying on themselves? Is a human being really going to stoop lower and be more servile than irrational wild beasts? After all, every single wild animal is completely self-sufficient. They are naturally provided with exactly the food they need, and a mode of survival that is perfectly adapted to and in complete harmony with their own nature. Epictetus then gets personal with his students. He says that, as someone who is older than them, he really should not have to sit there making a massive effort just to stop them from thinking small. He should not have to constantly discourage them from having mean, low, and overly humble thoughts about their own potential. On the contrary, the situation should be entirely different. If there were young men among his students who truly understood their deep kinship and connection with the divine, they would see things clearly. They would know that we humans have these metaphorical chains fastened onto us. These chains are our physical bodies, our material possessions, and whatever mundane things are required for our basic biological support and sustenance. If the students truly understood this, Epictetus says his job should actually be to hold them back. He should be the one actively discouraging them from their intense desire to shed all these earthly things like heavy chains and immediately return to their divine origin. That is the kind of effort that ought to completely absorb a true teacher and mentor. In an ideal world, the students would be so elevated in their thinking that they would come to their teacher and say, "Epictetus, we simply can no longer stand being tied down to this hateful, burdensome physical body. We are tired of having to constantly give it food and drink, making sure it rests, keeping it clean, and worst of all, having to associate with all manner of unpleasant and uncooperative people just for the sake of keeping this body alive." They would continue by asking, are not all these physical and material things completely indifferent? Do they not mean absolutely nothing to our true selves? And is not death itself nothing to be feared, not an evil thing at all? Because, after all, are we not closely related to the divine, having originally come from God? These idealistic students would plead, let us just go home then. Let us finally be free from these physical shackles that constantly restrain us and weigh heavily upon our spirits. They would look at the society around them and say, here in this earthly life, we only find robbers and thieves. We have to deal with corrupt law courts. We are ruled by so-called despots and tyrants who delusionally imagine that they wield some real power over us. But they only think they have power because they can threaten our physical bodies and our material possessions. Please, they would say, allow us to leave and show these tyrants that they actually have power over precisely no one. If the student said all that, Epictetus says it would then be his turn to step in and reply. He would tell them, my friends, you must wait upon God. Wait for the divine timing. Whenever the divine gives you the clear signal and officially releases you from your earthly service, only then are you truly free to return home. But for the time being, you must agree to remain steadfast in the exact place where you have been stationed. He would reassure them by saying that their time here on earth is actually quite short, and furthermore, it is very easy to endure for people who hold such strong philosophical convictions. Think about it, he would say. No despot, no thief, and no court of law can possibly intimidate people who place very little value on their physical bodies and all the accessories that come with them. Therefore, you must stay. Do not depart from this life without a very good, divinely ordained reason. Epictetus points out that this is exactly the kind of high-level, noble conversation and advice that should naturally pass between a true philosophical teacher and an idealistic, spiritually aware young person. But then he asks, what is the actual reality of the situation? The sad truth is that you students, and often even your teachers, behave no better than dead carcasses. You completely lack that higher spirit. The reality is that the moment you have eaten your fill for today, you immediately sit down and start anxiously worrying about where your food for tomorrow is going to come from. He tells them to look at the situation plainly. If you manage to get food tomorrow, then great, you will have it and you will live. If you do not get food, then you will simply starve and depart from this life. As he often reminds them, the door is always open to leave. So knowing this, why on earth should you complain? What possible room is there left for shedding tears? Why would there ever be an occasion to flatter someone just to get what you want? Why should any person feel envy toward another person? And why should anyone look up to and admire those who happen to own a lot of material possessions, or those who hold strong political power and are quick to act in anger? After all, what can these powerful, wealthy people actually do to us, or even do for us? The only things they have the power to control are physical and material things, which should be of absolutely no interest to us whatsoever. And as for the things we truly care about, like our character, our choices, and our inner freedom, these powerful people are completely powerless to affect them. Ultimately, no one who holds these strong philosophical convictions can ever be forced to act against their own free will. Finally, Epictetus asks how the great philosopher Socrates stood in relation to all of this. The answer is that Socrates behaved exactly as one would expect a person to behave if they deeply and keenly perceived their own kinship with the divine. He was fearless, self-sufficient, and entirely focused on his inner character, completely indifferent to the threats of despots or the lack of material wealth. Epictetus imagines the great philosopher Socrates speaking to his accusers during his famous trial. Socrates says to them, "Imagine if you were to offer me a deal right now. If you were to say, 'We will release you and let you live, but only on these strict conditions. You must no longer engage in the philosophical dialogues you have been conducting up to now, and you must promise not to give any more trouble or stir up any more questions among anyone, whether they are young or old.'" Socrates says that to such an offer, he would answer that it is completely absurd. He points out a powerful comparison. He says, "If one of your human military generals stationed me at a physical combat post, I would be expected to maintain it and defend it with my life, choosing to die 1,000 times over, rather than cowardly quit and run away." So if God, the divine creator, has assigned us a spiritual and philosophical post with a specific set of moral duties, how could we possibly decide to just abandon that post to save our own skin? It is unthinkable. Epictetus then tells his students, "There in Socrates, you have a prime example of a man who was a genuine, true kinsman of the gods. He truly understood his divine connection. But look at us on the other hand. Instead of identifying with our higher divine nature, we identify ourselves with our most basic physical parts. We identify with our stomachs, our guts, and our genitals. Because we are still so terribly vulnerable to basic physical fear and carnal desire, we lower ourselves. We flatter, and we creep and crawl before absolutely anyone who holds the power to hurt us, or deprive us where any of those bodily things are concerned. To illustrate this point about not fearing loss, Epictetus shares a story. He says a man once asked him to write a letter to Rome on his behalf. This man had recently met with what most normal people would consider a terrible misfortune. In the past, he had been very rich and highly famous, but he had later lost absolutely everything he owned and was now living a reduced life here in the city of Nicopolis. So Epictetus agreed and wrote a letter to the authorities on the man's behalf, writing it in a very deferential, slightly pleading and pitiful tone to try and get them to help. But when the man read the draft of the letter, he immediately handed it right back to Epictetus. The man told him, "I wanted your practical help, not your emotional pity. Absolutely nothing really bad has actually happened to me." The man understood that losing money and status was not a true harm to his inner character. Epictetus then shares another personal story about his own teacher, Musonius Rufus. Musonius used to constantly test Epictetus when he was still a slave. Musonius would warn him, saying, "Your master is going to afflict you with some terrible hardship or punishment." And when Epictetus would calmly answer, "Well, such is life. That is just the way the world works," Musonius would challenge him further. He would ask, "Should I still go and intercede with your master to save you, when I can actually get the exact same result directly from you?" What Musonius meant was that if Epictetus could simply accept the hardship with a calm mind, he had already saved himself. Epictetus explains that, in actual fact, it is completely silly and totally pointless to try to desperately get from another person what you can perfectly well get for yourself through your own inner strength. He expands on this, saying, "Since I have the power to get true greatness of soul and genuine nobility directly from myself, from my own choices, why on earth should I look to get something as trivial as a farm, or some money, or some political office from you? I will not be so completely insensible and blind to the immense value of what I already own inside my own mind." However, Epictetus notes, for men who are truly meek and cowardly, there really is no other option but to write these pathetic, begging letters for them. But you have to write for them as if they were already dead bodies. The letter might as well say, "Please grant us the dead body of this person, together with his very meager, pitiful ration of blood." Because, in reality, a person who begs and fears the loss of physical things amounts to absolutely no more than a dead carcass and a little bit of blood. If that person were anything more than just a physical body, if they had a true soul, they would fully realize that absolutely no one is ever made unhappy because of the actions of someone else. True unhappiness only comes from our own inner judgments. Epictetus then shifts his focus to a new topic, addressing those people who have dedicated and applied themselves entirely to seeking career advancement and political power in the capital city of Rome. He starts by making a critical observation about philosophers. He says, "If we who call ourselves philosophers had actually applied ourselves to our own job of moral improvement with even half as much seriousness and dedication as those ambitious old men in Rome pursue their political and financial interests, then we, too, might actually be getting somewhere and making real progress." He gives a specific example of this relentless ambition. He mentions that he has a friend, a man who is actually even older than Epictetus himself, who is currently in charge of managing the massive grain supply in Rome, a very powerful position. Epictetus remembers a time when this friend passed through their town of Nicopolis while he was returning from a period of political exile. During that visit, this man said so many things in deep disparagement and criticism of his former stressful, ambitious life. The man swore up and down that, when he finally returned to Rome, from that moment on he would devote himself entirely and exclusively to a quiet life of peace and tranquility. He kept asking rhetorically, after all, how much time do I even have left to live? But Epictetus was not fooled. He says, I told him directly to his face, I simply do not believe you. I told him that as soon as he got even a small whiff of the atmosphere of Rome, he would completely forget every single peaceful thing he had just said. Epictetus even added a prediction. He told the man that if even the absolute least amount of access to the emperor's court suddenly became available to him, he would immediately rush right back in, practically singing joyful hymns of praise to the Almighty for the opportunity. The man was defensive. He said, "Listen to me, Epictetus. If you ever find me even putting a single foot inside the emperor's court again, you can feel free to think as little of me as you possibly like." But Epictetus asks his students, so what did this man actually do in the end? Well, Epictetus tells us exactly what happened to his supposedly reformed friend. Before this man even reached the city limits of the capital, Rome, he received some official letters from Caesar. And just like that, he immediately forgot every single peaceful thing he had just said to Epictetus, and it seems he has not given his promise of a tranquil life a single thought since that moment. Epictetus says, I would really like to be there with him right now, just to repeat back to him the exact words he said when he was passing through here. And I would add, how much more of a shrewd, accurate prophet I prove to be than you. Now Epictetus pauses and asks his students, well, by criticizing this active, ambitious man, am I implying that man is an animal who is simply unfit for any kind of action? Not at all, he says. Action is part of human nature. So he asks, why are we philosophers not more active in our own proper sphere? He uses himself as an example to show their collective laziness. He says, just look at me. When the day begins, I remind myself of the philosophical author we are supposed to be reading and studying today. But then my laziness kicks in, and I think to myself, who really cares how this or that student reads the author? First, let me just go back and get my sleep. He contrasts this philosophical laziness with the intense activity of the politicians in Rome. And yet, he asks, how can their political and business affairs possibly compare in ultimate importance to ours, the business of the soul? If you could see those politicians at work in Rome, you would find that they do nothing all day long but vote on a minor resolution, and then huddle together for a while to debate and deliberate about the price of grain, or the management of public land, or some other mundane means to make a living and run the economy. He asks his students to compare the two pursuits directly. Is it really the same thing to receive a mundane political petition that reads, "Please allow me to export a bit of grain," compared to our philosophical mission? Our mission is to say, please learn from the great Stoic Chrysippus exactly how the entire universe is governed, and discover what specific place the rational creature, the human being, has within that grand design. Our mission is to say, find out too, who you really are at your core and what truly constitutes your own personal good and your own personal evil. Is one of these pursuits even to be compared with the other? Do they both deserve the exact same degree of application and effort? Is it equally wrong for a person to neglect the study of their soul as it is to neglect the export of grain? Epictetus then turns the blame slightly. He asks, well, am I and the other philosophy teachers the only ones who are guilty of being lazy and indifferent to this great task? No, he says, You young people, you students, are even worse. He uses a gentle analogy. He says old men like us, when we see young children happily at play, we like nothing better than to join right in with them in their game. Likewise, he says, I would be a whole lot more excited about joining you in deep, serious philosophical study, if I were, for once, to actually see you looking bright-eyed and genuinely enthusiastic about the work. The text then moves on to a new chapter titled Concerning Family Affection. Epictetus recounts a conversation. During a visit from a local magistrate, a man of some political standing, Epictetus was conversing with him and casually asked the man whether he had a wife and children. The magistrate replied that he did indeed. Epictetus then asked a simple question. And how do you like it? How is family life? The magistrate gave a blunt reply. I am miserable, he said. So Epictetus, naturally curious, asked how so. He pointed out the obvious. Men do not marry and have children in order to be miserable. They do it with the goal of being happy. The magistrate explained his misery. I am so constantly anxious about my poor children, the man said. He gave a recent example. He said that the other day, when my little daughter was very sick and appeared to be in real danger of losing her life, the anxiety was so overwhelming that I could not bear to even remain in the same room with her. I actually had to leave her side and go far off until someone brought me word that her condition had finally improved. Well, said Epictetus, probing the man's reasoning, do you think you acted correctly in this specific case, abandoning your sick child? I acted naturally, the magistrate answered, defending his emotional reaction. Epictetus accepts the challenge. If you can actually convince me that you acted naturally, he says, then I am completely ready, on my side, to show you that anything that is truly done in accord with nature is also done correctly. He is setting up a logical trap. The magistrate tries to justify it by pointing to common behavior. It is what nearly all of us fathers go through, he argues. Epictetus clarifies his position. I absolutely do not dispute that emotional reactions like yours occur, he said. That is a fact. The real point at issue between us is whether those reactions ought to occur. He uses an analogy to show the flaw in the magistrate's logic. He says, for by your reasoning, we must allow that cancerous tumors happen for the good of the body, simply because they do happen. And by your logic, we must say that doing wrong is perfectly in accord with nature, simply because all, or at least the vast majority of us, do wrong things. Just because something is common does not make it right or natural in the philosophical sense. So, Epictetus demands, show me how, exactly, your action of abandoning your daughter was in accordance with nature. The magistrate is stumped. I do not think I can, the man admitted. He then flips the question back to the teacher. Why do you not show me instead how my action is not in accordance with nature, and why such a reaction should not happen? So Epictetus begins his philosophical demonstration. He starts with a very basic premise. Well, he said, if we were in any kind of uncertainty about whether certain things were white or black, what specific criterion or tool would we adduce to choose between them and find the truth? Sight, the man correctly said, we would use our eyes. Epictetus continues to guide the magistrate through his logical exercise. He asks another simple question. And what about things that are hot and cold, or things that are hard and soft? What specific sense would decide the truth in those physical cases? Touch, the magistrate correctly answers, we would feel them. Now, Epictetus brings the analogy back to their current moral dilemma. Since we currently have a fundamental difference of opinion about what behavior is truly in agreement with nature, and about what is morally right and wrong, what objective standard should we apply here, do you think? I do not know, the man honestly admitted. Epictetus puts this ignorance into perspective. Well, he says, simple ignorance in discriminating between physical things like colors, smells, or flavors probably does no really great harm to a person's life. But not to know the truth about right and wrong, not to know about what is truly natural in a human being's case and what is not natural, is that just a minor shortcoming, do you think? No, the magistrate admits, realizing the gravity of his confusion. It is a very great one, I admit. Epictetus then challenges the idea that whatever people commonly do must be right. Consider this now, he says. Is absolutely everything that people commonly judge to be good and appropriate actually rightly judged so? For example, can the Jews, the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Romans all be perfectly right in the widely differing opinions they have about things like food laws and customs? How could they all be right? The magistrate replies, they contradict each other. Exactly, says Epictetus. Instead, if the opinions of the Egyptians are actually the right ones, I suppose it logically follows that the others are wrong. Or, if the Jews are right, then the others simply cannot be. No, they cannot, the man agreed. And Epictetus concludes this point. Wherever there is this kind of deep ignorance about right and wrong, there is also a desperate want of learning and instruction in the absolute essentials of life. The man agreed with this as well. Once you have fully realized this, Epictetus advises him, you will naturally occupy your mind and devote absolutely all of your attention toward finding that one true objective standard that discriminates between what is actually natural and what is not. And then, once you have found that standard, you will apply it rigorously to particular cases in your life as they arise. For the present moment, Epictetus says, I can only offer the following logical steps by way of assistance towards solving our specific problem regarding your daughter. Tell me then, he begins, do you think that genuine family affection is a good thing, and that it agrees with nature's highest norms? I certainly do, the magistrate answers. Then Epictetus asks a crucial question to link affection with reason. Can family affection be both good and natural, while at the very same time, that which agrees with human reason is somehow not good? Of course not, the man replies. Reason and the good must be aligned. So Epictetus deduces, whatever is truly rational will never be in conflict with genuine family affection. I suppose not, the magistrate concedes. Because, Epictetus explains, if they were in conflict, one of them would have to be in agreement with nature, while the other would necessarily have to conflict with nature. They cannot both be natural if they oppose each other. Correct, says the magistrate. So Epictetus concludes this part of the argument. If there is any action out there that is both genuinely affectionate and completely rational, this action, we can safely say, is also both morally right and practically good. Agreed, the man says. Now, Epictetus applies this standard directly to the magistrate's action. To leave your child's side when she is terribly sick and to just go away is clearly not a rational act, Epictetus states bluntly. And I do not suppose that even you will try to argue otherwise. But he continues, we still have to consider whether your action was actually consistent with true family affection, as you claimed it was. Then let us do so, the magistrate says, ready to examine it. Epictetus starts a thought experiment. Was it right for you, being so affectionately disposed toward your child, to simply go off and leave her? Let us look at her mother instead. Does not the mother feel deep affection for her daughter? Of course she does, the man replies. Then Epictetus asks, should the mother too have left her sick child's side? No, the man admits. And what about the nurse? Epictetus continues. Does she have affectionate feelings toward the little girl? She does, the man says. So should she also have left her? Certainly not, the man replies. And her personal slave and teacher, does he not have fond feelings for her? Yes, the man agrees. I suppose that logically means that he, too, should have gone off and left her, Epictetus says, driving the point home. The absurd result being that, owing to this supposedly very great affection on the part of her parents as well as her guardians, the poor little girl would have been completely forsaken by absolutely everyone who loves and protects her. She would be left to die in the company of strangers, people who had no part in bringing her up, and therefore had no special feelings of affection for her at all. I can hardly suppose that would be right, the man finally admits, seeing the ridiculousness of his own logic. In fact, Epictetus points out, it is deeply unfair and completely illogical to say that other people, whose affection is entirely the equal of yours, should not be permitted to do exactly what you claim was perfectly justified in your own case, simply owing to this very great affection you profess to have. True enough, the man says, thoroughly defeated on this point. Epictetus then turns the situation around to make the man feel it personally. I mean, he asks, if you yourself were terribly sick, would you want your family, your wife, your children, and the rest of your loved ones to be so incredibly caring that they just walk away from you and leave you entirely to yourself? No, the man answers. And Epictetus presses, would you really want to be so deeply loved by them that, precisely because of their great love, you would always have to suffer through your sickness in complete isolation? Is not that kind of abandonment much more like the kind of affection you would pray your worst enemies would show you, that they should just go away and leave you entirely alone? And if that is the case, Epictetus says, the inescapable conclusion is that what you did in leaving your daughter was not an act of affection at all. Well, Epictetus acknowledges, it had to have been something that affected you so deeply that you actually walked out on your sick child. He suggests it might be related to a similar kind of intense, irrational impulse that made a certain man in Rome cover his head in panic while his favorite horse was running in a race, and who later actually required wet sponges to be revived when his horse unexpectedly ended up winning. The precise psychological explanation for such extreme behavior might be a bit out of place for our current conversation, he notes. For now, assuming that the study of philosophy contains at least a single grain of truth, it is completely enough for you to be convinced that you will not find the cause of your behavior by looking for any external cause outside of yourself. Epictetus emphasizes this core Stoic principle. The exact same thing, he says, is always the fundamental reason for our doing something, or our not doing something, for our saying something, or our not saying something, for our being elated and joyful, or for our being depressed and miserable, for our going after something, or our completely avoiding it. It is the exact same reason that you are sitting here right now listening to me, and that I am sitting here saying the things that I am now saying. And what is that reason? It is simply our opinion, our internal judgment, that all these things are the right things to do. Of course, the magistrate agrees. If we actually saw things differently, Epictetus explains, we would act differently, perfectly in line with our different idea of what is right and what is wrong. He uses a famous example from mythology. This, then, was the actual cause of the great hero Achilles' intense lamentations and grief. It was not simply the external fact that his friend Patroclus died. We know this because other people certainly do not carry on in such an extreme way when a friend or a companion dies. No, the cause was the internal fact that Achilles made the choice to lament. The exact same cause lies behind your desertion of your sick daughter, Epictetus tells the magistrate. You simply thought it was a good idea at that particular time. Conversely, if you had decided to stay with her, it would be for the exact same internal reason. Your judgment that staying was the right thing. He gives another practical example. Right now you are about to return to the city of Rome. That is your decision based on your current opinion. But if that opinion changes, you will not go. In other words, he summarizes, it is not death, it is not pain, it is not exile, or absolutely anything else external you might care to mention that accounts for the way we act. It is only our own internal opinion about death, about pain, and about all the rest of it. Well, Epictetus asks directly, have I convinced you of this truth or not? You certainly have, the man admitted. As the cause is, so is the result, Epictetus concludes. Therefore, whenever we do something wrong, from this day forward, we will not blame anything at all except the internal opinion on which that wrong action is based. And we will try to root out those wrong, unhealthy opinions with even more determination and effort than a surgeon uses to remove cancerous tumors or dangerous infections from the physical body. By the exact same token, we will also acknowledge our own opinion as the true source of our good behavior, too. But as for a wife, a child, a slave, or a neighbor, Epictetus declares, in the future we will not name any of them as the authors of the evil or the misery in our lives. We will do this in the secure knowledge that, unless we personally judge things in a particular light, we will not act in the corresponding manner. And we ourselves, not any external factors, are the absolute masters of our own judgments. Agreed, the magistrate says, accepting the lesson. So, starting today, Epictetus challenges him. We will not trouble ourselves to constantly assess or analyze the quality or condition of our land, our slaves, our horses, or our dogs. Instead, we will only trouble ourselves to assess our own opinions. Well, I certainly hope so, the man said, perhaps realizing the difficulty of the task. You see, Epictetus tells him, if you truly mean to subject your own opinions to a rigorous, honest examination, you are going to have to become a student all over again. You will have to become that universal figure of fun, a grown man going back to school. And you know just as well as I do that this massive philosophical assignment cannot possibly be completed overnight. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled On Satisfaction. Epictetus begins by outlining the different views people hold on the subject of the gods. He says there are those people who completely deny the existence of any divinity outright. Then, there are others who say that God does indeed exist, but they believe he is idle, completely indifferent, and simply does not pay any attention to anything that happens in the world. A third group takes a slightly different position. They say that God does indeed exist and is even attentive, but they believe he only pays attention to the grand workings of the heavens and never concerns himself with the mundane affairs down here on earth. Then there is a fourth group. This group says that God actually does attend to earthly affairs, including the general welfare of humanity as a whole, but they believe he only does so in a very broad, general way, without ever worrying about the specific lives of individuals. And finally, there is a fifth group. Epictetus points out that great figures like the mythical hero Odysseus and the philosopher Socrates belong to this group. This group believes in a deeply personal, intimately involved divine presence. They say, I simply cannot make a single move without God noticing it. Epictetus says that before we do absolutely anything else in our philosophical journey, we desperately need to examine all these differing views separately, so we can carefully decide which of them are true and which are false. This is a critical step, he explains, because if the gods do not actually exist at all, then what possible sense can be made of the fundamental Stoic command to always follow the gods? It would be a meaningless instruction. Furthermore, how can following the divine be a sensible life goal if the gods do exist, but they do not have any cares or concerns about the world whatsoever? He takes it even further. Even supposing that the gods do exist and that they do care about the world, if that divine care does not actively extend down to individual human beings, and in point of fact, if it does not extend to me personally, then following them is still absolutely no worthwhile goal for my life. However, Epictetus argues, the truly intelligent person, after giving due and careful consideration to this massive question, will come to the right conclusion. That intelligent person will consciously decide to completely submit his own personal will to the supreme ruler of the universe. They will do this in the exact same willing, cooperative way that good, law-abiding citizens submit themselves to the laws of their state. Therefore, Epictetus says, all of our education and all of our philosophical training should be approached with this one primary goal constantly in our minds. We should be asking ourselves, how can I personally follow the gods at all times? And how can I learn to adapt myself perfectly to God's universal government so that I may truly be free? Because true freedom, you see, is not what most people think it is. True freedom is defined as having all events go exactly in accordance with our own will and never contrary to it. Now, Epictetus anticipates an objection. He asks, well, is this kind of freedom just the exact same thing as madness? Of course not, he answers immediately. True freedom and madness are complete opposites, they are poles apart. Someone might object and say, but true freedom means I want all my personal wishes realized exactly as I please, and never mind the actual reason behind them. Epictetus strongly corrects this. Now he says that kind of thinking is actual madness. That is pure insanity. Real freedom is something inherently good and deeply valuable. To just arbitrarily wish for things to happen simply because they arbitrarily seem to you to be the best outcome without any grounding in reason or reality is not a good thing at all. In fact, it is disgraceful. To explain this, he uses some practical analogies. He asks, how do we approach the basic practice of writing? When I am learning to write, do I just demand to write the name Dion in absolutely whatever arbitrary way I happen to please at that moment? No, of course not. Instead, I must learn to actually want to write it in the exact, specific way that it is supposed to be written according to the rules of spelling. He says the case is exactly the same when we learn to play music. We cannot just play whatever random notes we want and call it a melody. It is the exact same situation with absolutely every single art and science that exists. It simply would not be worth the time and trouble to try and learn them, otherwise, if they just completely accommodated everyone's arbitrary, uneducated wishes. And so, Epictetus concludes, since freedom is the absolute greatest and most valuable possession of all. It is the very last thing you would ever expect to be different from these arts and sciences. You cannot expect freedom to be a realm where your arbitrary wishes are simply given complete, unrestricted power. Rather, truly getting a philosophical education means actively learning how to bring our own personal will perfectly in line with the actual way that things happen in the real world. Which is exactly to say, we must align our will with how the supreme ruler of the universe has already arranged things. And how did the divine arrange things? He arranged for there to naturally be a cycle of summer and winter. He arranged for periods of great abundance and periods of severe lack. He even allowed for the existence of both virtue and vice. All such contrasting opposites are intentionally meant to contribute to the ultimate balance and harmony of the whole universe. Furthermore, as part of this grand arrangement, He gave each and every one of us a physical body with its various bodily parts. He gave us some material belongings, and He gave us our family members and our friends. Therefore, it is with this massive, unchangeable divine arrangement clearly in our minds that we should always approach our philosophical instruction. We do not study philosophy in order to somehow alter the hard facts of reality, since trying to change the universe is neither allowed by nature, nor is it actually better that the universe should be changed by us. Instead, we study in order to truly learn the deep nature of exactly what actually concerns us, and so that we can keep our own internal will perfectly in line with external events as they unfold. He gives a practical example of this acceptance. He asks, can we realistically just avoid other people entirely? How is that even physically possible? And if we do inevitably associate with other people, can we simply force them to change their behavior? Who on earth gives us that kind of magical power over others? No one. So, he asks, what is the realistic alternative? What actual means can be found for successfully dealing with all these difficult people? We must find a way that ensures that we always remain true to our own rational nature, no matter however other people around us see fit to behave. But Epictetus scolds his students. That is not what you actually do, though. No, instead of aligning your will, you constantly gripe, and you bitterly protest against every single circumstance you face. Look at your behavior, he says. If you happen to be alone, you complain and you call it terrible desolation. But then, if you are in the company of others, you immediately describe them all as a bunch of swindlers and backstabbers. You constantly curse your own parents, you curse your own children, you curse your siblings, and you curse your neighbors, all because you refuse to accept reality as it is. Instead, Epictetus suggests a radical shift in perspective. When you are by yourself, he says, you should not call it desolation. You should call it peace and liberty, and you should consider yourself to be the God's equal in that moment of tranquil independence. On the other hand, when you are with a large group of people, you should not complain that you are stuck in a noisy mob or an annoying crowd. Instead, you should view yourself as a joyful guest at a great feast or a public festival, and in that positive spirit, you must learn to actually enjoy it. He then asks, what is the ultimate downside or punishment for those stubborn people who simply refuse to accept reality as it is? The punishment, he says, is simply to be exactly just as they are. They punish themselves with their own misery. Is someone unhappy being alone? Then leave him to his isolation. His loneliness is his own self-inflicted punishment. Is someone unhappy with his parents? Let him be a bad son and grumble away. His resentment ruins his own life. Is someone unhappy with his children? Let him be a bad father. The consequence is his own ruined relationship. Someone might interject and say, but we should punish them. Throw him in jail. Epictetus replies, what jail? The man is in a jail already, since he is living in a state of mind that is against his own true will. And if he is there against his will, constantly fighting reality, then he is already imprisoned by his own mind. Conversely, he points out, the great Socrates was not truly in prison, even when they locked him in a physical cell, because he actively chose to be there in accordance with his principles. His mind was entirely free. Then Epictetus addresses a common physical complaint. But my leg is crippled, someone might cry. Epictetus answers sharply. Slave, he says, using a harsh term to wake them up, are you really going to be at odds with the entire universe just because of one lame leg? Should you not rather make the world a willing gift of it, and gladly return it to the divine one who gave it to you originally? Are you seriously going to make Zeus your personal enemy, and stubbornly set your face against the fates, the very divine forces with whom Zeus spun the thread of your destiny at the exact moment you were born, laying out his specific plans for your life? You ought to realize your true place, he tells them. You take up very little physical space in the world as a whole, speaking of your body, that is. In terms of your reason, however, in your mind, you yield to absolutely no one, not even to the gods themselves. Because reason is not measured in physical size, but in sense and capability. So, he asks logically, why not care primarily for that rational side of you, where you and the gods are actually equals? Another student might complain, but it is my bad luck to have awful parents. Well, Epictetus responds pragmatically, you could not very well choose them beforehand, could you? You could not sit up in heaven and say, let this particular man have intercourse with this particular woman, at this particular time, just so that I can be conceived exactly how I want. That is not how it works. Your parents had to come first, and then you had to be born exactly the way you are, born of parents exactly the way they are. But does that mean you have to be miserable? He asks. Let us look at an analogy. Let us suppose you completely did not understand what you actually had the power of vision for. It would be entirely your own bad luck if you foolishly decided to close your eyes just at the exact moment a beautiful painting passed before you. In the same way, you are even unluckier for being totally oblivious to the fact that you already have the internal power of patience to deal with all your difficulties. You completely forget the massive virtues of character that you have in reserve, right exactly when the problems that those virtues can control present themselves, and right when you could actually use their help. Instead of complaining, he says, you should thank the gods for making you strong enough internally to survive what you cannot control externally, and for making you only responsible for what you actually can control. Think about it. The gods have generously released you from all accountability for your parents, for your siblings, for your physical body, for your material possessions, and even for death and for life itself. You do not have to control those things. They made you responsible only for what is actually in your power, which is the proper use of your own impressions and judgments. So, he asks, why take on the massive, crushing burden of matters which you cannot possibly answer for? You are only making completely unnecessary problems for yourself. The text then moves to a short new chapter, titled On the Treatment of Slaves. It begins with a practical question about daily life. When someone asked Epictetus how it was possible to eat a meal in a manner that was truly pleasing to the gods, Epictetus answered with a question of his own. If a meal is eaten justly and equitably, in moderation, with personal restraint and self-control, is not that exactly what is pleasing to the gods? He expands on this with a very relatable scenario. When you are at dinner, he says, and you ask a slave for hot water, and the slave completely ignores you, or if the slave does hear you, but brings in water that is barely lukewarm, or if the slave is not even to be found anywhere in the house when you need him. To deliberately refrain from anger in that exact situation, and to not explode in rage at the slave, will not that calm restraint find immense favor with the gods? The questioner pushes back, but how are we possibly to bear with such incompetent, disobedient slaves? Epictetus gives a profound, humanizing answer. My friend, he says, it is not a matter of bearing with a piece of property. It is a matter of bearing with your own brother, a fellow human being who has Zeus as his ultimate ancestor, and who is a son born of the exact same divine seed as yourself, sharing the exact same high, divine lineage. If you happen to have been placed in a social or political position above others, Epictetus asks, are you automatically going to behave like a cruel despot toward them? You must remember who you truly are, and you must remember exactly whom you govern. You must remember that those people beneath you are actually your kinsmen. They are your brothers by human nature, and they are your fellow descendants of the supreme god, Zeus. But a slave owner might object, I have a legal bill of sale for them. I bought them with my money, while they certainly have no bill of sale for me. Epictetus dismisses this legalistic argument completely. Do you not see, he says, that instead of looking to the high, eternal laws of the gods, you only have regard for the dirt of the earth, for the dark pit, and for the utterly contemptible, temporary laws made by dead men? The text then moves to a new chapter, titled that God supervises everyone. Someone once asked Epictetus a profound question. How could a person truly be convinced that absolutely everything he did was actively supervised and seen by God? Epictetus answered this with another question. Do you not believe, he asked the man, that all things in the universe are fundamentally united as one single entity? I do believe that, the other man said. Well, Epictetus continued, do you not also think that there is a constant interaction and sympathy between the things here on earth and the things up in heaven? Yes, the man agreed. Epictetus elaborates on this connection. How else, after all, could natural things take place with such incredible regularity, acting exactly as if God were personally issuing direct orders to them? Think about it, he says. When God tells the plants to bloom, they bloom perfectly on schedule. When he tells them to bear fruit, they bear fruit. When he tells that fruit to ripen, it ripens. Similarly, when the seasons change, and he tells the trees to drop their fruit, to shed their leaves, to draw their energy inward and lie completely dormant for the winter, they do absolutely all of that too, in perfect obedience. Furthermore, he asks, how else can we possibly explain that the regular waxing and waning of the moon and the daily coming and going of the sun perfectly coincide with such obvious, predictable changes and fluctuations right here on earth, like the tides and the seasons? It is all one connected system. Epictetus then makes a logical leap from the physical to the spiritual. Well, he reasons, if simple plants and our own physical bodies are so incredibly intimately linked to the universe and all its grand rhythms, will not the exact same thing be true of our internal minds? Only even more so, because our minds are higher than our bodies. And he continues, if our minds are so deeply and intimately connected with God that they are literally divine sparks of his own being, is God not going to immediately perceive their every single movement? Of course he is, because those moving parts, our thoughts, are actively participating in his very own divine nature. He points out the incredible capacity of the human mind as proof. Now you, a mere human for your part, are fully capable of reflecting in great detail on God and his universal government, while at the exact same time you are also tending to your own mundane human affairs. You have the amazing ability to process in your intellect, and through your senses, a massive wealth of complex thoughts and impressions completely simultaneously. There are some impressions that you immediately assent to. There are others that you firmly reject, and sometimes you just suspend your judgment altogether until you have more information. Your human mind can securely store so many of these impressions, and it can gather them from a very wide range of different sources, too. Under the influence of all these stored impressions, your mind then proceeds to form complex ideas that correspond perfectly with those particular impressions. Epictetus notes that this incredible process is exactly how we form our memories, and it is exactly how all the many beautiful varieties of human art and science are created. So Epictetus asks incredulously, if a limited human mind can do all of that, are we really going to look at God and deny him the ability to oversee absolutely everything that happens? Are we going to deny him this power even when we already know that he is present absolutely everywhere, and that he constantly enjoys a kind of deep, unbroken communion with the entire world? He offers another comparison, this time with the sun. The physical sun, he says, is capable of brightly illuminating a very large part of the entire universe, just leaving unlit the relatively small shadow that the earth casts behind it. Well, he argues, here is God, the supreme being who actually created that sun in the first place. And remember, the sun is completely minuscule in relation to the whole vast universe. God is the one who still causes that sun to turn in its orbit. Given all that immense power, would you not say that God is in a pretty good position to clearly see absolutely everything that goes on everywhere? But still, someone objects to this idea of universal supervision, saying, "But I personally cannot understand or focus on all these millions of things at one and the exact same time." Epictetus answers this immediately. Is absolutely anyone here saying that your limited human capacities are the exact equal of God's infinite capacities? Of course not. Nevertheless, Epictetus reveals a comforting Stoic belief. Even if you cannot comprehend everything, God has still provided each and every one of us with our own individual guardian deity. This divine spirit constantly stays right by our side and is put in charge of personally looking after us. This is a perfect guardian who never, ever sleeps, and who is completely impossible to distract from its duty. Is there absolutely any other guardian in the world to whose care God could have possibly committed us that is better or more constantly vigilant than this one? Therefore, Epictetus gives a final, powerful piece of advice. Whenever you go into your room, close your doors, and turn out all your lights, you must remember this truth. Never, ever say to yourself that you are completely alone. Because Epictetus concludes simply, you are not alone. God and your guardian are always there with you. God is right there inside you, Epictetus says, and so is your private guardian deity. And remember, neither of them requires any physical light to watch you by. They see your innermost thoughts in the dark. This inner guardian deity, Epictetus declares, is the one who truly deserves your absolute pledge of allegiance. Think of it like how soldiers swear their loyalty before the emperor, Caesar. If those soldiers want to be paid, they must solemnly swear to put the emperor's safety first, above all else. You, however, have been specially chosen to receive an absolute abundance of divine blessings, and you get them all entirely for free. Given that, he asks, why will you not swear a similar oath of loyalty to God? And if you have already done so in the past, why not reaffirm that sacred commitment right now? What exactly is that oath? Epictetus spells it out. You must swear that under absolutely no circumstances will you ever disobey the divine will. You swear you will never press charges or find fault with God and the specific gifts He has given you, no matter what they are. You swear that you will not shrink away in fear from life's essential tasks or from its difficult trials. Can anyone seriously compare the worldly soldier's oath with ours? He asks. They swear to honor absolutely no one more than they honor Caesar. But we philosophers swear a much higher oath. We swear to honor absolutely no one more than we honor our own highest, rational selves, which is the divine spark within us. The text then shifts to a new chapter, titled What Philosophy Professes. Someone once came to Epictetus and asked for his practical advice on how to get his brother to stop being on such bad terms with him. Epictetus answered very clearly. True philosophy, he said, absolutely does not claim to secure for us anything that is outside our own direct control. Otherwise, if it did make those claims, it would be taking on matters that simply do not concern it. He uses an analogy of craftsmen. Just as physical wood is the specific material of the carpenter, and just as hard marble is the specific material of the sculptor, so the exact subject matter of the art of living is simply the life of the self. Your own life is your material. The man, confused, asked, well, what about my brother's life? How do I fix that? That in turn completely belongs to his own art of living, Epictetus explained. Your brother has his own material to work with. With respect to your life, your brother's attitude is simply one of the many externals. It is absolutely no different from owning land, having good health, or having a good reputation. And philosophy makes absolutely no promises concerning those external things. Instead, what philosophy promises is this. In absolutely every situation, I will keep my soul's governing principle in perfect agreement with nature. The man asked, whose governing principle? Only the one inside me, Epictetus answered firmly. You can only govern yourself. Still desperate for a practical fix, the man asked, how then do I stop my brother from being so angry with me? Epictetus replied, bring your brother directly to me, and I will gladly speak with him about it. But regarding his anger, I have absolutely nothing to say to you. You cannot control his emotions. The man, consulting with Epictetus, finally understood the lesson and rephrased his question correctly. What I actually want to know is this, then. How can I personally stay true to nature, even if my brother stubbornly refuses to reconcile with me? Epictetus answers this with a beautiful natural metaphor. Nothing truly important ever comes into being completely overnight, he says. Think about agriculture. Even grapes or figs need plenty of time to ripen properly. If you come to me and say that you want a fully ripe fig right now, immediately I will tell you to be patient. First, you absolutely must allow the tree to flower. Then you must let it put forth the initial fruit. And then finally, you have to wait patiently until that fruit is fully ripe. So he concludes his point. If the simple fruit of a fig tree is not brought to full maturity instantly, or in just a single hour, how on earth do you realistically expect the complex human mind to come to its philosophical fruition so quickly and so easily? Do not expect it to happen instantly. He warns the man. even if I myself were to personally tell you it was possible. It takes deep, patient work. The text then introduces another new chapter, titled On Providence. Epictetus tells his students, "Do not be surprised at all if other animals have all their basic biological necessities provided for them directly by nature. Nature gives them not just their food and their drink, but also a safe place to sleep, and they have absolutely no need of making shoes, weaving bedding, or sewing clothes. Humans, on the other hand, seem to desperately need all these extra things to survive. Why the difference?" He explains the logic of divine providence. It simply was not expedient or practical in the case of these creatures, because they were born specifically to serve others, meaning humans, and not to serve themselves. Therefore, it made sense for nature not to have made them in any way deficient in these basic respects. They need to be ready to work. After all, he asks them to imagine. Think what an absolute nightmare it would be if we constantly had to worry about finding clothes and shoes, or gathering special food and drink, for all our flocks of sheep and our working donkeys, all in addition to having to provide these exact same essentials for ourselves. We would be completely overwhelmed. He uses a military analogy to clarify. Just as human soldiers are expected to report directly to their commander completely at the ready, meaning they are already clothed, fully armed, and wearing their shoes, because it would simply be too much to expect the commander to have to equip every single one of them out of his own limited time and his own personal pocket. In the exact same way, Mother Nature has efficiently created the animals that are born for service so that they are completely ready for our immediate use and are in absolutely no need of any further attention or outfitting from us. The practical result of this divine biological programming, Epictetus points out, is that a single, small human child, armed with absolutely no more than a simple wooden stick, can easily control an entire massive flock of sheep. As it is, though, we humans completely neglect to give any thanks to Providence for the fact that we do not have to bestow on these beasts the exact same intense care and outfitting as we have to do for ourselves. And then, despite this massive blessing, we still have the nerve to complain to God concerning our own personal condition. Yet Epictetus swears, if we humans had even a single ounce of genuine gratitude or respect in our hearts, just observing the absolute least, most basic aspect of creation would be more than enough to get us to fully admit the existence of a caring, divine providence. And I'm not even talking about the truly great, cosmic things right now, he clarifies. Just take the mere, everyday fact that nutritious milk is mysteriously produced simply by a cow eating plain grass, and consider that solid cheese can then come directly from that liquid milk. Or think about the amazing fact that warm wool can actually grow right out of a sheep's skin. Who exactly is it that has intelligently created or brilliantly conceived all these highly functional things? No one, some foolish people say, attributing it all to random chance. What incredible ignorance and what sheer gall, Epictetus exclaims. Let us leave the major, chief features of nature completely aside for a moment, he suggests, and just consider some of its minor, secondary effects. For instance, is there really anything of seemingly less practical utility than a man's beard? But Epictetus argues, nature has found a most becoming and fitting use even for that simple hair, enabling us to easily and immediately discriminate visually between the man and the woman. Because of this, nature clearly identifies itself even from a distance. The beard essentially says, I am a man, therefore come and deal with me exactly on these specific male terms. Absolutely nothing else is needed for identification. You just have to take note of nature's obvious signs. In the case of the woman, he continues, in addition to deliberately mingling a noticeably softer note into her voice, nature has specifically removed the hair from her chin. But an opponent might argue against this logic and say, the human creature could have done very well completely without this physical distinguishing mark. We could just verbally announce of ourselves that we are a man or a woman. We do not need beards. But you completely miss the point, Epictetus counters. Look at how proud, how handsome, and how incredibly becoming the natural sign of a beard is. It is much more attractive than the colorful comb on a rooster's head, and it is prouder even than the majestic mane on a lion's neck. That is exactly why, he concludes on this specific point, we should carefully safeguard these physical signs that God gave us, and by virtue of which the two genders were originally intended by nature to be clearly distinguished. But he asks, are these few examples the only works of divine providence that are relevant in our human case? Hardly. In actual fact, there are absolutely no human words that are adequate to sufficiently praise all of nature's works, or to truly do them the justice they deserve. If we humans actually had any real sense, there is absolutely nothing better we could ever do with our limited time than to constantly praise God and loudly proclaim His exceptionally good works, whether we are doing it in public or in our own private lives. We should be praising Him continuously, even while we are busy doing manual labor like digging, plowing a field, or simply eating our dinner. We should be saying, God is truly great, because He has generously given us these physical instruments and tools so that we can work the earth. We should be saying, God is great, because He has given us our hands, our mouth, and our stomach. He has given us the amazing biological ability to just grow unconsciously without having to think about it, and the miraculous ability to continue to breathe even while we are fast asleep. This gratitude is exactly what we ought to sing on absolutely every occasion. And more especially, we should sing the greatest and the absolute holiest hymn of all, celebrating the supreme rational ability that He bestowed exclusively on us. The ability to actually understand all of His complex works, and the ability to use them systematically. Well, Epictetus sighs, since most of you people are spiritually blind and refuse to do this, I suppose there has to be someone who actively fills this role. There has to be someone who will take on the job of praising God on all of your behalves. He humbly offers himself for the task. And really, what is a crippled, lame old man like myself actually good for anyway, except for singing God's praises? If I were a beautiful nightingale or a graceful swan, I would simply sing the natural song that either of those birds was born to sing. But I am a human, a rational being. And so, because of my rational nature, my particular song must take the higher form of a philosophical and spiritual hymn of praise. That is my specific job in this life, he declares. And it is a job which I will steadfastly keep to for as long as I am permitted to live. And he concludes the chapter, I openly invite absolutely any and all of you to join me in this chorus of gratitude. The text then transitions to a new chapter, titled concerning the necessity of logic. Epictetus poses a fundamental philosophical problem. Since human reason is the very tool that analyzes and coordinates absolutely everything else in our experience, it makes sense that reason itself should not go unanalyzed. But this raises a question. Then what exactly will reason be analyzed by? The answer is logical. Obviously, reason must either be analyzed by itself, or it must be analyzed by something completely different. Now he explains, if it is something different, this other thing must either just be another form of reason, or it must be something that is somehow superior to reason. But that second option is completely impossible, since, in the Stoic view, there is absolutely nothing in the universe that is superior to reason. Reason is the highest faculty. But Epictetus argues, if it is true that this first reason is analyzed by another form of reason, we must then ask, what in turn will analyze that second reason? Will it analyze itself? If that is the case, however, the very first occurrence of reason could have simply done the exact same thing from the start. Whereas, if yet another, third form of reason is constantly required to analyze the previous one, the whole logical process will just continue forever in an endless, impossible loop. Therefore, reason must be able to analyze itself. A student interrupts and says, "Yes, I understand that logic is important, but in any case, is it not far more important that we tend to our daily passions and our personal opinions and all the practical things like that?" Epictetus sighs. So he says, it is only moral lectures about these practical subjects that you would much rather hear. Fine, but consider this, he warns them. If during one of those moral lectures you say to me, I really do not know whether your philosophical arguments are logically sound or not, or if I happen to use a specific word in an ambiguous sense and you ask me to please distinguish its exact meaning, well, I am not going to be in any kind of mood to oblige you. In fact, I am much more liable to sarcastically throw your own words right back at you and say, no, it is more important that we tend to our passions and our opinions, and the like. Which, Epictetus supposes, is the exact reason why we Stoics put the rigorous study of logic right at the very head of our educational curriculum. We do it for the exact same reason that, before a large quantity of grain can actually be measured out, we absolutely must first settle on an agreed-upon standard of measurement. After all, he asks, if we do not begin the process by firmly establishing the correct standards of weight and volume, how on earth are we ever going to accurately measure or weigh absolutely anything at all? We would just be guessing. And it works similarly in the present philosophical case. If we have not first fully grasped and rigorously refined the mental instrument, meaning logic, by which we analyze and understand all other things, how can we possibly hope to understand those other moral things with any real precision? We need logic to make sense of ethics. The stubborn student argues back, but a simple measuring bowl is just a mere thing made of dead wood, and it certainly does not naturally put forth any living fruit of its own. True, Epictetus agrees. It does not grow fruit. It measures the grain, however, and that is its vital purpose. The student tries another angle. Well, matters of pure logic are completely unproductive as well. They do not produce good behavior on their own. Well, Epictetus says, we will see about that. But even if you are completely right that logic itself is unproductive, because it analyzes and carefully distinguishes all these concepts, logic essentially functions, in a very real way, as the fundamental weight and measure for all abstract moral matters. And that function alone is reason enough, as all the philosophical experts say, to rigorously study it. You ask who says so. Epictetus asks rhetorically. Besides the great founding Stoics like Chrysippus, Zeno, and Cleanthes, I mean. How about the philosopher Antisthenes? It was he who famously wrote the maxim, the absolute beginning of all education is the careful examination of terms. And furthermore, as we know from the writings of Xenophon, the great Socrates himself routinely began all his philosophical talks by carefully analyzing the specific terms he was using, precisely in order to forestall and prevent any possible uncertainty as to their true meaning. So Epictetus asks, does this mean that this is the ultimate philosophical achievement then? Just getting to the point where we can finally understand and successfully interpret the complex logical writings of Chrysippus? No, absolutely nobody is saying that. Logic is a tool, not the end goal. Well, the student asks, what is the ultimate achievement then? The true goal, Epictetus states, is deeply understanding the will of nature. Yes, that is the goal, but can you actually understand the will of nature all alone and completely unaided? Evidently not. You could still use some serious help. Because, he reasons, if it is true, as philosophers say, that we humans always err and make mistakes unwillingly out of ignorance, and if you were already in full possession of the absolute truth, that truth would immediately be reflected in your completely flawless, perfect behavior. But your behavior is not flawless, so you still need help finding the truth. So you admit, but I do not understand the will of nature. Who will actually explain it to me? I am told that the great Stoic teacher Chrysippus can explain it. So Epictetus continues the hypothetical scenario. Off I go to find out exactly what this famous interpreter of nature has to say. But then, as soon as I start reading him, there is a complex passage I simply cannot understand.